Okay, so let's look at this game played today on Wii Chess. So we're white. We open with the English opening. Opponent goes NF6. I go into F3 to try to prevent E5, but I'm going into the fianchetto system. So he goes with top line move E6. So I go into fianchetto, and he challenges the center with D5. Now here, of course, there's a choice. You can play D4 right away or go into fianchetto. I'm trying to get away from the D4 systems, going back into the Queen's Pawn opening theory set and really trying to stick with the English. So I just fianchetto. But I've been struggling in my games with how to deal with this hanging pawn on C4. So we'll see what happens. So he goes to C6. We can see here it's the fourth played move according to Live Book. So he sets up like a semi-Slav structure. And here again, with regards to controlling the center, the D4 is always going to be suggested in these lines. B3 is a possibility too. We can just fianchetto on B2. But in this case, I just continue development with Castle. He's back to the top line moves. And now again, we get into the opportunity to play D4 and we play D4. He castles and we just continue our development with N to C3. So noting that I could have potentially played Queen to C2 with the idea that if there's capture right away, we would just recapture on C4. So I do N to C3 to develop into the center. And he plays the knight takes. And now we go completely out of book. So NE5, this is turned into a closed Catalan as the chess base software notes down here. So what it's saying is this is where my theory broke down. So we'll turn on the engine at this point and take a look at what it says. So now this is where I should have realized we were going into Catalan theory and just really play NE5 right away. So if there had been NCE5, then we would have had potentially if B5, then we just start to take on C6, and this is completely undermined, right? So it creates a major weakness. So it's the exposure of this bishop on G2 that creates really good pressure along the white square diagonal. So I completely missed this, and instead went with E4. Now this was not good according to the engine. I just really wanted to dominate the center, but I really should have played an E5, recognizing it was a Catalan. So now he starts to play some really slow positional play. So NB to D7, and I'm really trying to step up my control of the center here, given that he's kind of collapsing a little bit and sort of being slow. This bishop on C8 will be very difficult to develop. So I go with Queen to C2, and he plays into b6. And I thought this was a really strange way to try to hold on to that pawn on c4. So at this point, just want to potentially continue my developments. I'm thinking about where the bishop should go, and I think that on b2 it would have excellent control over the central dark squares, and if we undermine the queen on b3 would be a good play too. But I note here that the engine doesn't totally approve of that, even though B3 does show up here with Fritz's analysis. So we go with B3, not worrying about the fact that we're down a pawn. So I'm trying to have much more accelerated development in exchange for that pawn. So I'm not worried so much about the material right now. Actually, it wanted the recapture on A was a potential too, which would open my A file for the rook. So now he plays a very slow move and should have really undermined, as the engine's noting here with c5, just completely undermining the center. He decides not to and plays a very slow move with h6. So this is typical of club play, just completely ignoring the center. So I just continue the development with b to b2, wanting to control the center, and he plays rook to e8, which seems like a developing move, but is kind of tucked behind his pieces quite a bit. So I want to get to central control of the files. And so you can see in the analysis here that the evaluation's about even. It was actually, I was expecting my rook should be on D and E. The machine seems to be noticing these pawns should have really come to the C file, which is interesting. But I went with RA to D1, thinking it was opposing the queen, so control the center. And now he plays queen to C7, just getting out of the line of the way of that file. And now I play RF to E1, controlling the open files, and r to d8. So now he's moved his rook twice, and I think this is pretty slow play on his part. And we need to think about how we attack the center. And so my idea here was, with his sort of underdeveloped pieces, so the bishop on c8 and rook on a8 are completely out of the game. My idea was to go into the center and then follow up with f4 as a strong play. So he decides to challenge that by going backwards at n at b to d7. And in this case, what I wanted to do is just get in with f4 with the idea that if he plays capture, we just recapture with the f pawn, pinning this pawn on e6 and then preventing the development of his bishop, which is obviously going to come out on the king side, queen side, sorry. But the interesting thing is the top line move, the engine's noting, if we wanted to keep the game even, we would have dropped back to d3, which would be a very good controlling square in the center. This pawn on d4 would become vulnerable, but we could again move our knight and reposition. So it's playing some very subtle positional analysis that is actually a move I didn't really consider. I just wanted to keep going forward into the center with f4. He decides to take. And here it was just f takes, and already the Fritz is not evaluating our chances well. So we take with the f pawn, and he plays nh7, and I think this was a move that really I think he would have been better to go back to e8. So getting the knight completely away from central square control, I have to take advantage of the fact that I'm trying to really build the center. So I play r to f1, thinking that this pawn on f7 could be targeted. He's exposed the file, and potentially if we develop the rooks, and my other thought was potentially queen to f3 and potentially to g4, given that he's going to have trouble getting this bishop out, and the bishop potentially coming to c1 that tactically would, pinning the king, could potentially take on h6. So play r to f1, just simply going to the open file. But we can see already that the engine's evaluating us as down a pawn. So this was a surprise to me. I thought my center and his lack of development would have really been a positive for me, but the engine analysis does not agree. So queen to b6, again pinning, so doubly challenging the pawn on d4, and of course pinning the king. So I have to be a little careful about my d4 position. I play ne2, strengthening the d4 pawn, and he decides to take on b3. So I offer up the exchange with the idea that I can just simply recapture towards the center, and that should be okay. Although we have to think about the fact that we are down a pawn, so exchanging material probably will not be in our favor. He plays bishop to g5, and I didn't think, and we see this jump in the analysis, and I got this part right. I thought this was a poor move. I think he really should have focused on the development of these two pieces, and it shows how moving pieces multiple times, and especially into a square where it can be targeted, is really not a good idea. Machine is suggesting, and there is a drawback here, of course, now that he's left this dark square diagonal, the machine's noting a move that I didn't actually think about, which is b to a3. And that probably should have been played. There's minimal pressure on d4. We can get this influence through these central squares into his territory, so that's an interesting play. I didn't actually think of that. And the other thing is it prevents the potential undermining with any c5 move, so I actually didn't consider that move. I do play h4, just simply bringing my pawns forward on the king side, which is where we're going to attack, getting a free tempo, and he just drops back to e7. And now I try to double the rooks on the f-file. So I'm really looking at the fact that these pieces over here, rook on a8, bishop on c8, are completely out of play. I want to target his king side right away, so let's bring all the pieces over. But again, the engine's still showing us at a bit of a deficit. So I play r to f4 with the idea that it could become a target again. But now he plays a move that wasn't good. So he could have had b to d7, just trying to come into the center, potentially push, get out over here somewhere. Again, he should be thinking about development. He plays g5, weakening the squares around his king, and this gives me a little bit of an opportunity. And so I want to remove the cover around the king. So I just take on g4, again recognizing that, thinking that he would play the bishop again to recapture on g5. But we note that there are no targets on this dark square diagonal, so I could move the rook pretty easily. But instead he decides to recapture with the knight, which is interesting defensive play. And so the problem is there's a tactic. So if I were to have played, I did consider rook to h4, but I noticed that if the knight were to come into here, there could be a check, and our rook would be hanging by the bishop, even though the engine doesn't entirely approve of that. So anyway, I wanted to double, so RD to F1. So we just continue the development on the attack on the king side. And he decides to play b6. So this is where he's obviously noticing that my knight on e2 and rook on f1 could be a potential pin. And so we need to kind of get out of that pin. And here's a move that I wasn't totally sure about. So I play r to d1, going back into the center, noticing that if we have this strong bishop, we can take advantage of the fact that c6 is, the drawback is that c6 is now weakened. So we could use our central pawn dominance and our bishop's cutting through to really push this. So he decides to go with a5 with the idea that this pawn majority on the queen's side is challenging my pawn on b3, which is a pretty good idea. And now the engine's showing we're down about a pawn. So d5, I just decide to push in the center, thinking that it's got to be now. C takes, we recapture with e, and at this point the engine likes e takes d5, which he does play. And now recapturing was a mistake. So now we're down about a pawn and a half. So at this point, it did like r to h4 with the idea that I guess if, and I don't quite see how that's right, but all these moves are not good anyway. But I would have thought if we look at this, this is what I was worried about. But we could just, now we're actually winning two minor pieces. So on b takes h4, we're just simply recapturing. So it would have been unwise for him to do that. So I didn't calculate that through properly. The two minor pieces for the rook would have made sense. So we go back, and it's r takes d5, and now he just wants to exchange material. And I realized that being down a pawn and having this 2-to-1 pawn deficit on the queen side, trading material's bad. So he does recapture, and the game is now completely lost. So down 23 pawns according to the engine at this point. We recapture with bishop, r to a7, king to h2, and what I'm trying to do is just simply, and he's made a mistake here, by the way. Let's see. This is interesting. So he should have played, according to this, n to h3 check. Yes, of course, because these are now, this is what I was worried about, and I did see this during the game. So the drawback of leaving g2, always look for the drawbacks of your move, is that this was available. So he could have played that for free and just completely missed it. When he missed it, I decided to do something about that and play king to h2, cutting that off. So he's missed a tactical opportunity there. B to e6, and this was the move I thought basically won him the game, because if I recapture here and it's pawn recapture, or even the knight as a blockading square, hitting with tempo on the rook, I've completely blocked in the influence of my dark squared bishop. So I was desperate to avoid this. So I go b to c6. He plays bishop takes on b3, so now he's got that 2-pawn majority. So if I can't do anything quickly, the game's going to be lost. So n to d4, b to e6. Again, I don't want to capture, so I try r to h4. And it's showing actually this game back to even, according to the engine evaluation. So n to b5. Yeah. So that was an interesting one. So n to b5. So I thought if I did actually look at this, but obviously didn't evaluate it well, because I could have potentially saved the game according to the engine. So it's showing about down a third of a pawn had I played this. If that comes in, he cannot stay on the 7th rank. So he's going to lose the piece. He's going to lose the rook no matter what. So he's going to have to go back. Actually, it likes b to d5. I guess, challenging with the idea that he gives up 2 minor pieces. That's interesting. B to D5. So if I were to take, and then that's just a huge advantage. So I think we've B to D5. Yeah, so he wants R to D7. So he's contemplating the giving up the exchange to stay back in the game. So I should have played that. But instead, let's go back. Sorry. So B takes B3. I do end to D4, trying to hit with that. And with the idea of coming into F5 and forking this pawn, which is a defender of the king, and then, of course, the bishop, which is hanging. Goes B6. R to H4, targeting the weak pawn, but that was a poor idea. King to G7. And now I missed another opportunity. So again, the machine wants N to B5, so I really should have thought of that. I think if the rook comes back to either of these light squares, if I'm on knight on B5, I can just hop into here. And that would have been a tactical shot. So N to B5 was missed. I really should have played that. But I'm low on time at this point. N to F5, offering up the exchange with the idea of just pushing forward with the E pawn. But B takes, and then I try a simple check. But the game is lost at this point because I missed that tactic on the queen side. So just that with check, and he just simply blocks. So I think from this one, the warning is really in the opening theory. I think there was a mistake. Instead of in a C3, like we can go back and look at the idea that I think my ideas in the center were relatively okay. Queen of C2 could have been considered here, but I think the real weakness of the game was really that any E5 had to be played here. We needed to recognize that we had shifted into a closed Catalan with probably favorable circumstances, as the engine is noting. We're starting to get a good lead and really get that knight into the center, attack this pawn on C4, and really get the power of the bishop developed.